wanted to be here. Let me give a little brief introduction, then I'll turn it over for the official introduction to my favorite deacon. Oh no, wait, Joe's here, never mind. Anyway, Dr. Stanley was my doctor at the VA hospital, and he always took extra time. It's like some doctors, they'll be looking at their chart, they don't even look up at you, but he sat down, crossed his arms, talked, how you doing, and how's your family, and where are you now? He just got to know me. It was nice to share. But so he always had a very deep concern. And then he talked about his book and about the presentations that he's given. And I tried to get him at St. Columkills, and there were some issues with, well, it was COVID. We had some difficulties. Never worked, but I am actually delighted. Before I came here, though, he had given me this book and autographed it. He made a special trip over to St. Columkills Parish to deliver this. And he autographed it, and I've cherished this. Now, and then I didn't know I was going to be stationed here at St. Robert's. I'm just glad that I didn't sell this on eBay now. Thank God I still have the book. That would have been embarrassing to get here. But I know we're looking forward to the presentation. I know it's going to be enlightening, heart-wrenching also, the physical death of Jesus Christ. So Joe, if you'd like to present, Deacon Joe.
One quick question, Doctor. Is his humor curable?
No.
Okay, sorry. I just had to ask that question because we're living through it now. So. Anyway, Dr. Gerard Stanley Sr. has practiced family medicine for over 40 years. He has also served as clinical preceptor for the medical school faculties of the University of Iowa, the University of Nebraska, and Creighton Medical School. He is the past president of the Iowa Academy of Family Physicians and is currently practicing medicine for the Veterans Administration. For more than 30 years, Dr. Stanley has traveled around the country presenting on the topic of Christ's Passion. In 2009, he published his book, He Was Crucified, Reflections on the Passion of Christ. It won the World Publishing Association Best Gift Category book in 2010 and is available on Amazon for anyone interested. Dr. Stanley and his wife Midge, of over 45 years, have been members of St. Robert's for the past 4 years after moving to Omaha to be closer to family. Their daughter and son-in-law, Katie and Matt Pearson, are also members of St. Robert's and have 2 children, Nora and Luke, currently attending St. Robert's School. They also have 3 sons and their spouses, as well as 7.5 other grandchildren. Half?
One's due.
Left, right, or middle? And so I would like to present Dr. Stanley.
Thank you, Joe.
You bet, sir.
And thanks, Father Dave, for allowing me to do this presentation, and for Deb for arranging all of this. Can you hear me okay?
A little louder.
Very good. Louder?
Can you hear me?
Most people want me to be quiet. Is there a volume button on here, Joe?
We'll sure find out.
Turn it way up.
AV's not my thing.
Anyway, I appreciated Joe's introduction of my 45-year-old wife, Midge.
Thank you.
That was close.
Okay, it'll work.
You might want to, you'll hear better here, maybe. Hold
No,
on.
he doesn't want the
You
mic.
might feel that other seat closer.
I'll see it.
Try that.
Is that any better?
Yeah, so it's better.
Yep.
Much better. Yeah, much better.
Thank you. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. speaking on Christ's passion and what he went through brings me closer to Jesus' suffering and everything, and I hope that comes across tonight. I'm very passionate about Christ's passion. And my talk is based on a paper that Dr. William Edwards, who is a clinical pathologist, since retired, but he was at the Mayo Clinic, and he and his colleagues wrote this paper in 1986 to kind of address the issue, did Christ really die on the cross, or was he taken down, resuscitated, kept alive, and really didn't die on the cross, be buried, and resurrect on Easter? And I think as you see as we go, those questions will be answered. This is a copy of the book. I'm not here to sell the book. If anybody wants it, it's on Amazon, and if you want me to sign it, I'll do that, but I'm not here to sell books. If I asked everybody to come up with a word for pain, what's the worst pain you could have, you would come up eventually with excruciating. Okay? Excruciating is out of the cross, because crucifixion was considered the most vile and painful form of capital punishment ever, and probably still is. And it said that the Romans didn't invent crucifixion, but they certainly perfected it with their studies of anatomy and physiology. Crucifixion was very well known in Christ's time because it dates back several hundred years to when the Persians took over that part of the world, and they used to want to get people off of their sacred ground, the warriors, the people that lived there. And if they couldn't crucify them, which may have been to a tree or boards or something, then oftentimes they would take a spike, a long post, and run it up between their legs, eviscerating them and sticking it in the ground, which would get their feet off of sacred ground. So Alexander the Great, in his conquest of the world, brought this punishment, this way of killing people, back to the Romans, and they used it for hundreds of years and perfected it. There were in 71 BC, there were over 6,000 people crucified on the road between Capua and Rome. That's about 120 miles, and that comes out to about 100 feet. Everybody was crucified, so you would have 2, maybe 3 people crucified in the distance of this Rome. And in 71 years after Christ, in the siege of Jerusalem, there were over 500 people crucified every day. They ran out of crosses, they ran out of nails, they ran out of space for crosses. So it was a capital punishment that the Romans and the Jews of that time were very familiar with. Constantine outlawed crucifixion when he converted in 314, but it has still been practiced at times. And in 1953, Dr. Barbet studied the crucifixion practices in the Dachau prison camp. And they would take these prisoners and crucify them, and then check their blood pressures and their pulses and their anxiety levels and their perspiration and just all of the vitals and everything else they could record to try and get an idea of what else could be done during crucifixion. Now, when we talk about the cross, there's 2 different types of cross. The low cross, or the tau cross, is the one that looks like a capital T. It doesn't have much of a rise of the stipes. And the Latin cross is the one that does have the rise in the stipes. The upright or the stipes weighed about 200 pounds, whereas the patibulum, which is the crossbar, weighed somewhere in the vicinity of 100 pounds. It would be like a heavy railroad tie today. And because of that weight and the examination of the Shroud of Turin, it's felt that Jesus probably carried just the patibulum. But to severely whip somebody as Jesus was and expect them to carry 200 to 300 pounds of a cross would not have happened. The titulus was a board or some kind of a banner that the crucifixion detail would carry, announcing what this person, who it was and what their crime was. And Jesus was crucified as King of the Jews. And here's a picture of the titulus in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And artists have a little bit of latitude. Years later, they started abbreviating it INRI as opposed to the true Latin words and things. But here's a picture of, oh, I keep hitting the wrong button and I'm sorry. This would be a person carrying a cross. The Shroud of Turin does not show any rope burns on Jesus' arms, so they think he was just forced to carry it freehand. It also doesn't show any wrist marks holding him to the patibulum when he was crucified, so it was felt that the nails themselves did the job. The tau cross stood about anywhere from 6 to 8 feet from the ground to the top. It wasn't way up there like some artists have portrayed it through the years, so he was only about 7 or 8 feet off the ground. And when you bend your legs and you're strapped to the cross, you could still reach the person, and it's not like a lot of the artistry. When the person was crucified, they were incapable of helping themselves, and they may be on the cross for anywhere from 3 hours like Jesus, which was very quick, to 3 to 4 days writhing on the cross. And that's part of the reason they felt the stipes would have to have been affixed in the ground for stability. For some full-grown man writhing for 2 to 3 days, it would have broken loose and not been supported. But when the person was crucified, the insects would land on him, the flies would land on him, they'd lay their eggs, and they'd have maggots and other bugs crawling out of all of these open wounds. And the birds of prey, you're only 8 feet high, but these birds of prey could come down, and the first thing they do is they poke the victim's eyes out, and then you're left there. Now the other thing is that being that low to the ground, the wild animals had free access to their legs and other parts of their body that they could run up and bite and tear off in pieces. And nobody could help them, and the person couldn't help themselves. There was a process of breaking the legs, skelicopia, to guarantee the victim died. And as we will show you, that the process of breathing on the cross meant you had to push your legs up. And if you broke the legs, the shock of the fractured bones would, if that didn't kill you, then you couldn't move on the cross. You couldn't push yourself up because your legs are broken. And that would mean that the victim would die very quickly. Now the centurion recognized that Jesus was dead. Here's a professional Roman soldier on the crucifixion detail. His name was Longinus, actually. And he recognized Jesus was dead, and then they would take a spear, and they were taught the death thrust with their about a 5 to 6 foot spear, that's how they defeated their enemies and conquered the known world at that time. And it would go through the right side of his chest and into his lung and then the heart. And that would certify that the victim was dead. And that was the one thing that the centurion, two things he had to do. Number one, he was in charge of the whole process, and the victim couldn't die from scourging or being beaten or anything else. He had to die on the cross, but then the centurion had to certify that he was dead. I would ask that we go through three things, three reflections. The first is the agony in the garden. Second is scourging and carrying the cross. And the third is the actual crucifixion. And I would ask, what is so disturbing that would cause a man to sweat blood? Now, we've all seen people in agony in hospitals. We've all been stressed. We've seen people, it's like you just feel so badly for them because you can't help them and they're totally distressed. I've never seen anybody sweat blood. But the crucified people in the Dachau prison camps sweat blood to the point that the cement, this was in the middle of winter, the cement underneath them was stained red. And it's felt that this is some of what Jesus was going through. And as the ultimate burden of being a man and being God, he could not only know what was going to happen, he knew he was going to be crucified, but he actually suffered it in person as in the agony while he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. We know that Jesus foresaw his future. He told his disciples that before they went to Bethany the week before that. He told them that he was going to be leaving them and he would send someone for them at the Last Supper. We know that he suffered a tremendous amount of stress. The account from the apostles talk about how distressed Jesus was. And it was just more than he was just praying to God. We know that after the Last Supper, with the stress of what went on in the Last Supper, and the creation of the sacraments, the revelation that he would be leaving, the revelation that Peter would deny him, the revelation that one of the apostles would betray him, would have caused a lot of anxiety, a lot of emotion, and a lot of questions, and everybody's trying to get answers and trying to figure all of this out that night. And they would then walk through the city, and Jerusalem at that time was a city of about 25,000 people. But during Passover, which is what everybody came to the city for, that holy day, there were over 300,000 people. So the city was jam-packed with people. The countryside would have had campfires and people all the way around, just a lot of commotion, a lot of religious fervor, because they're there to celebrate their holy day, the Passover, but yet they're being occupied by the Romans. They didn't like the Romans. The Romans hated the Jews, and they hated Passover because it was just a tremendous weekend to work, or a holy day to work, and there was just a lot of religious as well as political unrest. We know that in the Garden of Gethsemane, it's talked that Jesus suffered severe mental anguish. He asked his Father for help. It's always reassuring to me when you are in trouble, which I never was, but my brothers were. They would always ask Dad for help. Jesus asked his Father for help. Please don't make me do this. We've all been there with our parents. And it makes Jesus feel more personal to me to know that he did this. We know that he was visited by the devil. Well, we've all been tempted by the devil, but to actually have a visitation like he had on the mountaintop after being in the desert for 40 days, the devil comes and you can imagine he's trying to get him to not go through this, just say things. And God the Father sent him an angel to be supportive. And don't forget the devil was an angel at one time, and you can picture Archangel Michael being there to protect Jesus. We know that he sweat blood, and Luke tells about Jesus praying in anguish with great intensity, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. That's a process of hemohydrosis. And what happens is the skin with the sweat glands, the little capillaries feeding the sweat glands under pressure and emotional stress rupture into the sweat gland. That little drop of blood mixes with the sweat that's in the gland, and when you perspire, which Jesus did, the sweat and perspiration falls to the ground. It's heavy because it's perspiration full of blood, and it looks like you're sweating blood. And that's what was described in the medical experiments in the Dachau prison camp. It's also reassuring that Jesus went through the same stages of grief that we go through when we lose a loved one or we're diagnosed with serious illness. We go through the 5 stages of grief, which are isolation. Jesus isolated himself in the Garden of Gethsemane away from his apostles. Okay? He tried to get away. He tried to fight anger. He got angry with them when he came back and found them sleeping. He had removed himself to Bethany. He got angry at the money changers. So he was going through stages of grief as he realized his last few days on earth and what he was going to have to go through. He bargained with his Father to, please don't make me do this. Jesus appeared anguished and depressed to the apostles. And finally, the last stage of grief is when you accept what God wants you to do. Jesus accepted that he would go through this. And he resigned himself. There will be no more bloodshed except his. But no more fighting. He was committed to going through crucifixion for the salvation of our sins. And how many have had a friend turn against them or say bad things, do bad things to you? And you can take that anywhere from kids all the way up to adults doing bad things to each other. But Jesus was betrayed by a man that he put in charge of the money. He had lived and walked and had good times and bad times with this man for 3 years. And his friend turned on him. Very heart-heavy emotion to put up with. He was taken to Caiaphas' residence. He was kind of like the head honcho of the Pharisees. And he and Annas tried to come up with charges to punish Jesus and maybe get him to be crucified. And when that wasn't going to happen because the witnesses contradicted each other, they took him to the temple where the large Sanhedrin was gathered, and they would have all been there because this was the biggest holy day of the year. And they took him in for a bigger trial, and the Jewish historians, and then later the Roman historians, talk about how Jesus, throughout the night, was beaten, hit in the face, and spat on by the Jewish guards. The Shroud of Turin shows a broken piece of cartilage across Jesus' nose, so we know he got hit probably everywhere. Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor, Jesus was presented as a blasphemer. He was for treason. And Jesus is being tried for blasphemy. Jesus was the true word. And how many of you have tried to get across that this really happened, this is the truth, and nobody believes you? And we're talking about Jesus. Well, keep in mind that Pontius Pilate was notorious for just putting people to death just because. I mean, he would crucify people for no reason whatsoever. And the Jewish people thought, well, this will be a slam dunk situation. Take Jesus in, tell him he's a blasphemer, punish him, put him to death, we're through with it. But the Romans were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. And here, Pontius Pilate has a chance to talk to the Son of a God. He'd heard that this man worked miracles. He got people up from the dead. He would cure leprosy. He would cure people. He wanted to talk to him. He didn't want to put him to death. He wanted to talk to him. When they couldn't come up with charges sufficient enough to crucify him, they sent him over to Herod Antipas. Now don't forget, Herod's dad is the one who killed all of the babies when Jesus was born. Antipas, who was just as bad as his father, had just killed John the Baptist, beheaded him. He was just a nasty, mean man. And he was supposed to be a ruler for the Jewish people. They didn't like him. Jesus wouldn't talk to him. It was like he didn't matter. He wasn't going to address him. He wasn't going to give him the time of day. Well, with that, with no response, they sent him back to Pontius Pilate. And the Sanhedrin figured, well, okay, if we can't get him for blasphemy or for being the son of a god, what if we have him tried as a king? He was a subversive, and he was a threat to Roman authority. Well, that was the Achilles heel for Pontius Pilate, and he said, okay, I wash my hands of this, but rather than lose his job or lose his head from Rome, he went ahead and said, okay, we will crucify him. So part of crucifixion is scourging. The last jab that Pontius Pilate had to the Jewish Sanhedrin was the titleists said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Well, they didn't want that. They just wanted Jesus of Nazareth. They didn't want him to be their king out in public, even though that's what they brought him for. And he said, what I have written is written. And that became his titles. Here's a picture, Hebrew, Greek, Latin. Here's a relief of Pontius Pilate, the ceremonial washing of his hands. I'm no longer responsible for this man's death. It's on the Jewish people. When we talk about the path of that night, the upper room where Jesus had the Last Supper was somewhere in this vicinity. After the supper, they went through the southern gate into the Kidron Valley and over to the Mount of Olives. Now they had been to the Mount of Olives, they rested there, they gathered, Jesus talked to his people and things. They were very familiar with the Gethsemane. And you can imagine that if you take a town of about 25,000 people, and now you put 300,000 people in it and around it, everywhere around where they were at would have just been fires, campfires, and celebration of that holy day. When he was brought back from Gethsemane, he ended up being taken to Caiaphas's residency, which is in here. You can see right there. That's where his first trial ensued. Sorry, folks. And from there, he was taken to the temple. From the temple, he was taken to the fortress. From the fortress, he was taken to Herod's, back to Pontius Pilate in the fortress, and then marched to Golgotha. Now this trek is about 3 miles through thousands of people, and Jesus was scourged severely enough that he could not carry the cross from the fortress to Calvary, which is about 1/3 of a mile. The second reflection is, what does it mean to be scourged? Could any man in Jesus' physical condition have survived the punishment that he endured during the scourging? Now keep in mind that Jesus was about 33 years old. He had just finished his ministry for 3 years on foot. There was no mention of any sickness or illness or anything, so he was a 33-year-old man in pretty good health. But he'd had no sleep, no food or water since the night before the Last Supper, and then during the Last Supper. We know that at Gethsemane he suffered great emotional stress, enough that it would cause him to bleed blood. We know that through the night, the Jews and then the Romans beat him throughout his whole body, and that night he had walked under duress 3 miles. Jesus was scourged with a flagrum, which is a whip made of a wooden handle, and straps of leather with sheep bones, and the sheep bones were the cervical vertebrae because they were small, you could wrap them, and they were very sharp, and metal balls. And what would happen is the metal ball would hit the skin, causing it to welt up, and then the sheep bone would grab that hunk of welted skin and pull it off his back. And he would get those metal balls and the sheep bones pulling at the skin and the muscle as it kept happening and happening through the night. Most of the strapping would be in this direction with 2 people doing the beating. We know that Jesus wasn't just scourged, he was severely whipped. This was accounted by the Roman historians, who were amazed at how severely he was whipped. The whipping or scourging was designed to weaken the victim, cause pain, destruction, and it would destroy. It would destroy the skin, the muscle. It would break bones if hit correctly. It causes contusions of your kidneys, contusions of your lung, making both sets of organs just kind of start to fail and eventually fail completely. Kidney and dehydration, weakness, early shock was obvious because of the extreme perspiration, the continuous blood loss. He was in shock. and the severity determine the survival. Now, if you put severely whipped with the fact that Jesus died quickly on the cross, quickly enough it surprised Pontius Pilate, we know Jesus was beaten severely. Remember I said the centurion was in charge of the whole process, and he could determine how many whips they could use. The historians documented that. Jewish law, when they were lashing people, limited their lashes to 40 minus 1. But don't forget, this was not the Jews doing the whipping, this was the Romans. This was their king. They didn't like him, they didn't like the Jews. They were given free rein to destroy this man as long as they could keep him alive, so he'd die on the cross. Somebody made a cap, or the Shroud of Turin showed over 120 lashes. Now figured 40 might kill you, he had 120. And that's only the ones they could document. You could imagine the same piece of muscle and skin being hit over and over again. You wouldn't count them, you wouldn't be able to count those. But this is how many they could count. The cap of thorns that was figured and put over his head showed over 70 wounds, 70 thorn wounds in Christ's head. They mocked him by putting a nice robe over his shoulders as a king. He had a crown. They gave him a rod. Here's your rod. Here's your king's rod. They spat on him, struck him in the head, again with a crown of thorns on his head. As Dr. Edwards pointed out, prior to the crucifixion, Jesus was critical and irreparably broken. Had he been taken off the cross and taken to one of today's emergency rooms, he would most likely have died anyway. How bad was the scourging? We see that in the Via Dolorosa, the Stations of the Cross that we pray on Fridays, Jesus was paraded in humiliation, and it was a way of intimidating the Jews. You screw around with the Romans, we're doing this to your king, think of what we're going to do to you too. It was a way of controlling the Jews. We know that he fell, they say 3 times, but he needed assistance. I like one of those Stations of the Cross because it points out Simon of Cyrene. Now there aren't too many people in Jesus' life that actually had the opportunity and the privilege of helping him. But Simon of Cyrene was picked from the crowd, made to help Jesus fulfill his promise of dying on the cross. We know that Jesus met his mother. There's nothing said. They didn't say they talked. But you can imagine Mary's eyes seeing what's going on with her son, beaten almost to death, being humiliated, carrying a cross, and knowing that he's on his way to be put on that cross and die. The arrow in her heart. Think of what Jesus felt when he saw his mother and what he was putting her through. I don't think words needed to be said or documented, but you can imagine the feeling between a mother and her son. We know that Jesus warned the Jewish women, don't cry for me, cry for your kids, because 70 years from now, they're going to be crucifying 500 people a day at the siege of Jerusalem. And if you want something gory to read, study the siege of Jerusalem. We know that a lady, we assume it's a young lady, but a lady was allowed in the middle of all of this commotion to get into Jesus, and she wiped his face. Now, we've all had hot, sweaty days where sweat and dirt we're just covered, and how good it feels to just wipe your face dry. You don't get it clean, but it feels so much better. And this person helped Jesus by wiping his face. And we know that Jesus was forced to continue on to Golgotha. The third reflection is, what did Jesus really undergo for us when he was crucified? The first thing, we see all of the pictures of Jesus being disrobed, and they look real kind of, they're taking his robe off of him. But here's a man whose body has just been ripped open, ripped to shreds. He's got bleeding shards of muscle and tissue on all of his body, and they put this robe over him. You can imagine the blood that had congealed. And then they weren't nice taking it off. They didn't soak it like you do a Band-Aid trying to get off, because it hurts. They would rip this off of his body, causing tremendous pain and reopening all of his wounds. When he got to Golgotha, he would have been thrown onto his back on top of the patibulum, the cross beam, with a crown of thorns in his head, landing on the ground or on the patibulum, pushing those thorns deeper into his scalp. He had his hands nailed with 5 to 7 inch spikes. His legs would be bent, feet affixed, the titleist applied, and he would be left to die. Remember, I said the Romans didn't invent crucifixion, but they perfected it. They knew the anatomy of the wrist and the arm and the hand. They knew the anatomy of the feet, the rest of the body, and they knew that where to put the nails to cause the most pain. When we talk about the wounds being reopened, Jesus had continuous slow blood loss and excruciating pain. Dr. Barbet did a lot of studies, and Zugibe did a lot of studies on what it would take to hold the weight of a body. Were the nails placed in the palm of the hand, up the forearm, across the wrist, and they came up with the Z-space, which how many have had carpal tunnel? And you know that median nerve runs right underneath that little channel. When you put your little finger and thumb together, you get a little indent right there. That's the median nerve, and the flexor retinaculum goes across that. And that's what they have to release to relieve the pressure and the pain on that median nerve. Well, they knew that if you drove a spike through that, it would crush the median nerve, but you missed the radial artery, you missed the ulnar artery. So what you get is relatively bloodless, but excruciating pain, causing fiery bolts of electricity up both arms into the neck, both arms as you're being stretched. Then they would bend the feet and affix those to the cross. Here's a picture of the spike, and again, not to be too redundant, but the spike through there would crush the median nerve. You miss the radial artery and the ulnar artery, both going to the hand. There's a lot of discussion about how were the feet affixed. The Shroud of Turin shows left over right foot with one nail, but they've also postulated that, and people were nailed the easiest way sometimes. They would put both feet on the side of the cross and nail them both sideways through the heel. If you put a nail or a spike between the second and third metatarsal, you go through the perineal nerve, the medial and lateral plantar nerves, but you miss all the arteries going to the foot. So they know where the nerves are. They know that if you drive a spike through there, it's going to be very painful, but you're not going to bleed much, which means you're going to last longer. Death on the cross was from several different factors, but while you're hanging on the cross, in an effort to breathe and continue to breathe and stay alive, you have to exhale and inhale. And your body, as you're pulled out this way, you're pulled into forced inspiration, kind of an emphysema chest. So you're full of oxygen, but you can't get it out. The only way you can get it out is to push yourself up and exhale. The weight of the body fixed the ribs, and when you can't exhale and get rid of the carbon dioxide buildup, you get muscle cramps and tetany with the hypercarbia. Every time you wanted to exhale, you would have to pull yourself up on your wrists with spikes in them, rotating your shoulders, pushing up on your feet with spikes in them, pushing your back and butt against the stipes with all the torn tissues, and pushing your head with all the crown of thorns. As you scooted up the cross, you would hang there for as long as you could hang there and exhale, inhale, catch your breath, try and get things regulated until you were so tired you fell right back down, pulling your body open. And you would have to go through that over and over and over again. And we know Jesus did that for 3 hours. Each respiratory effort was agonizing, painful, and tiring, and you finally became so exhausted, you became asphyxic, which is what we feel eventually got Jesus. He was basically too tired to keep breathing. Here's a picture of a crucified man, and you can see that everything was pulled out and open, kind of, like I say, an emphysematous chest. And to breathe and exhale, you had to push up on your feet, twist your wrist, push up on your head, push on your back until you couldn't hang there any longer, and sink back down and do it again. We know that Jesus spoke 7 times from the cross. Speech generally occurs in exhalation. We know that delivering any message to his people would have been very painful. He eventually cried out in a loud voice, bowed his head, and died. The Roman soldiers and onlookers recognized his moment of death. The centurion who was in charge of the crucifixion knew Jesus was dead when he died. His body was requested before sundown, and the rapid death surprised Pontius Pilate, and the centurion, Longinus, performed the death thrust with a flow of blood and water. pleural fluid, pericardial fluid, and right ventricle blood. And as you can see, putting a spear through the right side of the chest would puncture the pleural lining of the lungs, which after all of the contusion and beating and the scourging, the lungs would collapse. They would fill with fluid from inflammation. It would then penetrate the pericardium, or the sac around the heart, and the right side of the heart, or the right ventricle, had most of the pressure delivered to it because blood was trying to get up and it couldn't get out. So it would build up and you would have a rapid right-sided congestive heart failure that you couldn't get rid of the blood, and it would swell the right ventricle. So when a spear pierced it, the blood from this right ventricle would flow down this spear right along with the pericardial fluid and the serous fluid from the lungs. Death on the cross was multifactorial. There's so many things that took place. The victim was in Jesus was in hypovolemic shock from dehydration, continuous blood loss. The crown of thorns bleeding continued even after he died. The electrolyte abnormalities from the contusion to the kidneys and contusion of the lungs and kidneys work together to regulate acid base in the body, and with the destruction of the blood cells, all of the electrolytes would have been messed up, some high, some low, and we could go through that, but all of that, especially with the potassium, sets you up for arrhythmias. Again, acute right-sided heart congestive failure. The pericardial effusion around the heart would keep it from beating properly because it couldn't expand. There's a fluid bag around it now, and it can't go anywhere. So you get more congestion, more right-sided heart failure. And eventually you get too tired to keep breathing. Death was cumulative and multifactorial, and as Dr. Edwards' conclusion was that Jesus was indeed dead prior to the spear in his side. Now I'm going to ask if you go through these three reflections with me again, but let's go through them backwards, okay? You've got a man who is strapped and nailed to the patibulum. His arms are pulled apart, his chest is pulled open. He's got a cap of thorns on his head. He's trying to stay alive and keep breathing. Every movement would cause pain in his feet, in his arms, in his back, his head. As he hung there and couldn't help himself, with continuous perspiration, continuous agony, continuous blood loss. The second reflection is the destruction of a 33-year-old man's body with straps, with balls and cheek bones. Over 120 lashes were counted on the Shroud of Turin. He was literally, his skin was literally ripped off his body. His lungs didn't work anymore because of the contusions. You take enough pounding on your lungs, they fill with fluid and collapse and don't work right. The same thing with the kidneys. The kidneys shut down. And now you don't have any regulation of your acid or bases in your body. And your muscles go into tetany, your heart can go into tetany. It's like having a full body Charlie horse, and you can't move and get out of it. And the first reflection is the Garden of Gethsemane. It's my feeling from reading what it was described Jesus did, sounds like the Dachau prison camp experiments and what they did and what they went through. And I believe that Jesus' ultimate burden as a human and God was that he could know what was coming and feel what was coming. And he went through the agony and the perspiration and the sweating of blood prior to his resignation to his Father and acceptance of what was going to happen in the next number of hours. Reflecting on the passion of Jesus must lead us from the scourging and the agony and the crucifixion that Jesus went through to the empty tomb and the living witness of those who saw Jesus risen from the dead, alive and in the flesh. Lent and Good Friday must end in Easter. Jesus fulfilled his promise, was resurrected for us. His death is my death and your death. His resurrection is my life and your life. And he went through this for us. Every time you look at the crucifix, just don't picture that nice, pretty man up there. Think about what he looked like and what he went through for our salvation. And thank you all for coming. Father Dave, thank you for allowing me.
Listening to the medical details, it's just horrific. It makes me so sad to realize just how much he suffered. It gives me a meaning, though, when we make the Stations of the Cross, when we read the scriptures on Passion Sunday, on Good Friday. I know it just touches me. There's no greater love than to lay down your life for another. Wow, what an amazing love he had for each of us. So thank you, Dr. Stanley, for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you. I tell people that I started doing my talk to junior high CCD kids when we lived in a small town in Colorado. And I would love to continue delivering my feelings on the Passion to junior high and high school kids. And part of the reason is they ask some really tough questions. So if there's anybody has any questions about anything, if I can answer it, I will. Yes, Joe.
The St. Margaret's Cross in the church, on the back side of it, you know, I think when the sculptor put it in, it was trying to get as close to the depiction of the Shroud of Turin as possible. And have you ever looked at the back side of that cross?
No. No, I haven't. Father said I can't go back there.
But it is breathtaking to see on the back side of that cross.
I'll take a look at it. I'm looking for one that I had here. I got a whole lot more if you want to get into, well, I'm not going to find it, but
Oh, that's what he gave to the medical student.
there's a crucifix, or a a huge cross in Redemptorist Church in Kansas City where we grew up. And they did a huge renovation and remodel and painting and absolutely phenomenal. And one of the things they had to do was take that cross down. And they talked about not putting it back up. Nobody knew where it came from. It had been there since day one of the church. There was such an uproar about not putting it back, they cleaned it up and put it back, and everybody said, fine, that's Redemptorist. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous church, and the crucifix had special meaning to the parishioners. Yes, sir, you had a question?
I've always been mystified by the fact that they put the spear into his right chest, knowing that the majority of the heart is in the left chest. Is there anything in reading that you've done to specify why they made that choice?
No, it was just, they also knew that you had more right-sided heart failure. By the time they put a spear in, I don't think it would have made a whole lot of difference which side
No,
it went
I
into.
don't either, but I don't think they understood the physiology of right heart failure in those days like we do today. But just from the general anatomy of the body, the heart being on the left, it's just something that I found funny.
I don't know. I never heard one way or the other why they went that side or the other, but that's the side that shows on the Shroud of Turin, and that's what they describe.
There's a good representation on the large cross that is just by the Lambo in our altars here of the Kidney in the hand. It's a beautiful detail and a very large text you could look at, and as well as the feet.
Yes, it would cause you to cramp up. You can do that to yourself or somebody that when you squeeze that median nerve, you claw like your hand.
It's an amazing artist recreation of that posture.
Yes, ma'am.
This isn't directly about the crucifixion, but I often wonder, since Jesus knew beforehand what would happen, if he ever shared this with his mother.
No, not that anybody would know. I mean,
She knew.
I never heard that.
She knew.
And I know most likely he just left the Last Supper and went to Gethsemane, not to meet his mother again until he had already been condemned. But before that, I don't know. I don't know. Yes.
So I think I've read before that they thought he might have had a broken nose from falling when he was carrying the cross. Is there any other thoughts around injuries he would have had just from carrying the cross and falling?
Well, they don't think Jesus had any broken bones, but the Shroud of Turin shows the cartilage, which is not a bone, shifted off to one side, and they talk about how much he'd been beaten in the face all night, all the next day, by not only the Jews, but then the Romans.
Hold on just a sec. So people can hear you. Okay.
This is not significant, but it means a lot to me. Did Mary see Jesus being scourged? Because I just think of the pain that would be as a mother to watch your child scourged. So I just hope she didn't.
Yeah, I think she.
Probably not, because that was being done in the Roman fortress, and I don't know if they would have let Jews in or women in. Yes, ma'am.
Two things. One, he was thrown into the pit. I think it was at Pontius Pilate's house. Do you know when that was? Before the scourging, after the scourging?
I'm not sure what you're talking about.
When he went to Caiaphas' house before the fortress.
Oh, yeah. What's your question? I'm sorry.
Well, that was just a comment. And then the question was, or the other thought was, that I had heard, we always see the crucifix, of course, with him having a loincloth on, and actually he had nothing on.
Correct.
Not only the physical and mental pain, but the emotional pain of humiliation.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable.
The only thing I could imagine is that he had a robe on because he was being paraded as a king, and it was a mockery to the Jews. And they said they stripped it off of him, but I don't think he had a loincloth or anything.
No, not when he was crucified, I don't think. When he was actually hung on the
Right.
cross. Yeah.
Mike, did you have a question? Anyway, I want to thank you guys.
Hold on.
Oh, one more.
It used to really upset me to walk into a church and see a crucifix where he is really dangling, and like the anatomy you explained, how his legs were bent and how his arms were up and his neck was down. But I have a new appreciation of it now. I used to kind of get mad at the church, like, why would you show that crucifix? But I'm glad I came to this talk, because that's actually how he would have looked.
There was a beautiful crucifix in one of the churches that I spoke at in Florida, that in their prayer garden.
Is it destined for that?
Yes,
The Resurrection Church?
yes,
That's when my daughter was getting married in September, and it really bothered us that it was there. And they don't have a crucifix right in the church, but it is in the prayer garden.
yes,
And now I think that helps us get.
yes. It's striking. It's emotion provoking to see a man trying to twist his body to keep breathing, and he can't move his feet or his arms. It's very, very, thank you.
Doctor?
Yes.
Of all the movies that we've seen from Hollywood, what movie depicts the crucifixion? I know I've seen The Passion numerous times, and it's real difficult to watch that movie, but I think it depicts it fairly well as to what, have you seen any other movies? Or
No.
was even The Passion of Christ, that movie?
I think The Passion of Christ was right on. It came out at the same time as my book. And everybody, oh yeah, you guys talk to each other? But it follows what I just said, and it follows what you read and things that happen. I thought it was extremely well done, and I talked to one of the guys who was a consultant on that, and he said he was Jewish. He was firmly believed that the things would go on while they were making that movie, and things were going on with people back home, these folks' families getting well, getting over cancer, doing things that you couldn't explain. I thought The Passion was just fantastic, but if you go back 30, 40, 50, 60 years, they didn't have the special effects and the time and know-how to put it together like they did. I thought that was a fantastic movie. I appreciated it more the second time I saw it than the first time. Yes, Joe?
You mentioned at the Passion for the movie, things extraordinarily happen, right? Now let me ask you, as you were writing this book, did you sense any fruit of something extraordinarily happening? Because you're basically doing the same thing in a book that they did in a movie.
I could tell you some stories. I could, and I remember I did a large chunk of the writing in the mornings. You'd wake up at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, and you have to go to work in a couple hours. You get up and you got something in your head and you put it on paper. And there were times when you would just write through the night, and when you get through, you read it and you say, well, I didn't really write it like that. And it sounded better than anything I could. There are things that come out in that book I don't know that I'm capable of doing or saying or putting them. So, did I feel inspired? Yes. It's a tremendous experience, and it just fortified my desire to share my message on the Passion.
You
And,
said you've done this for 30 years, or 40, 30?
well, since 87. It's and we can tell you stories about doing that too, but,
Any other questions?
I just want to share something. In our Seeking Truth Bible study, we're covering the Psalms, and a lot of Psalms in too short of a period of time. But one of the Psalms, and the interesting thing about the Psalms is that they were written like long before like these things happened, and yet they're spoken of in the Psalms. And there's a psalm that starts with, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so I've always thought that God was kind of like it was a moment of despair or, fear or something. But now I'm thinking it was like he was starting the Hail Mary. It was like a rote prayer. The Psalms were the prayers that they prayed all the time. And that Psalms ends very hopeful. And I thought, here he is. He's starting this prayer for the people that are there who've been witnessing this. And they know the whole prayer. And they know that hopeful ending of redemption. And I just thought I'd never known that before. I always just knew that one line that he said. I didn't know that was a start of a rote prayer that he knew that ended that way. And to me, that was just beautiful. So you might, I don't know, is that Psalm 23 or Barb, do you know what?
20, I think it's 22.
22, so you might want to look that up.
okay.
Any other questions? Oh,
The Shroud of Turin, some people say it was Jesus. Other people say it's not. What is your thoughts?
Some people say what?
The Shroud of Turin is the image of Jesus, and other people say it's not.
If I believe it is, after reading about the shroud, Barry Schwartz was director of photography for the shroud when they were allowed to expose it and take samples and things, and he's a devout Jewish man. I talked to him. He said there is no doubt in his mind that was the cloth that enveloped Jesus. It has all of the markings of what was described, and nobody else it's not documented that anybody else died that horrifically. I'm not saying that they didn't die and it wasn't, it was terrible, but he had all of the same markings that were described, and I believe it is the Shroud of Turin.
But it is actually Jesus.
Yeah, that it was Jesus, yes ma'am.
Yeah, 'cause I could vote.
The only thing I know is that when they exposed it last, to put an end to the questions, it just created more questions, which it usually does when they start studying religious things.
couple more questions. One more, anybody have any? Thank you very much.